The drama of Chad and Lori Daybell, something we've been watching for quite some time here, and it doesn't ever really seem to come to any sort of an end. Chad's trial is on the way. Lori has another potential trial coming up very soon. Will either ever see the errors in their ways, to put it lightly, or are we going to see more drama as this case continues to unfold? Joining me right now to discuss all of this, Leah, who is the author of the book When the Moon Turns to Blood, The Disappearances of J.J. Vallow, Tyler Ryan, and the horrible story that is the Daybells. Leah, I want to talk about kind of how this all begins, because this is a story that goes into, of course, extreme beliefs, which is what they are all about. Snake oil profits, pretty much, Chad. And answering that question, if the world is ending, how do you act? And maybe Chad and Lori Daybell are the perfect example of how people act when these sort of things happen. Let's kind of start there. How did you dive into to putting this book together, and what was the initial thought process going into this?
Yeah, so it started for me in December of 2019, kind of when the news started to be, excuse me, in the headlines that these children were missing, that this mother was gone, that she was maybe hiding out somewhere waiting for the apocalypse, and it maybe had to do with her strange cult-like beliefs
Hmm.
was initially what I saw. At that point, I'd been coming off several years of writing about far-right extremism in the Western United States, and specifically about the fringes of the LDS Church.
Hmm.
So, to me, it started with a question. This woman is supposedly has these fringe Mormon beliefs, maybe sort of cult-like beliefs. Are they similar to things that I had reported on in the past? And it turned out that they were similar. That once I started diving into her beliefs, but also the beliefs of Chad Daybell, her now husband, it started to become pretty clear that these were ideas forged kind of at the edges of the church, in the extreme survivalist, prepper, end times
Yeah.
community, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, and that's I have been very interested in all of that, and these people aren't just created in a vacuum.
Mhm.
It's very easy to go, well, she's crazy, he's crazy. That's all. No, these people are formed some way. They weren't always this of what we
Right.
see today. So I'm going to take a backtrack on all this, all the way back to the LDS Church, because I get a lot of, well, they weren't LDS, and technically at the time of all this, they weren't, but
Sure.
there was a path that kind of led them here. And I'm curious about that, and what you have found and what your thoughts are. This is not a let's bash the LDS church segment or anything like that, but it's a let's look at reality here. Let's look at what is going on that seems to create people like this, or at least lead some people who may already be on a bad mindset or some sort of mental disorder to go down some of these paths. Like, I can't tell you the inordinate amount of cases this year, and you've probably seen them too, that are
Yeah.
LDS or former LDS that are very high
Right.
profile. It's so out of proportion to
Right.
everything else. What's your thoughts on all that? Is there something within LDS that kind of gets you on that path to diving off into some sort of other extreme belief? Because that seems to be what a lot of these do. They go to the extreme fringes, and then it's something else. And LDS says we have nothing to do with this.
So yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and honestly, it's the thought process that I was going on trying to
Mhm.
understand. What is this?
Yeah.
I grew up in the West, have lived in Oregon my whole life, and always have known Mormons, and
Hmm.
and thought initially this is not what I remember people, families, and of friends of mine believing. So
Hmm.
a lot of that question started earlier for me when we had a 41-day takeover of a federal property in Oregon by a group of armed militiamen. The Bundy family is what they're called. Many people are familiar
Hmm.
with them. I made a whole podcast about them called Bundyville. And with that story, I bring it up because I went to interview the family to ask that question. Are your standoffs with the government, they had had two at that point, motivated by your religious beliefs? And they told me about a fringe, basically urban legend that's very popular at the edges of the LDS Church called the White Horse Prophecy. It's fake, The church in Salt Lake City says we don't believe it, it's not verified. But people who do believe in it think that the prophet and founder of the LDS Church, Joseph Smith, apparently said to someone at some point that in the future the Constitution will be so threatened it'll hang by a thread as fine as silk fiber, as it's written, and that it'll be up to the Mormon people to save it. So in the case of the Bundy family, they were taking over federal properties because they thought about this. They believed in this prophecy. So with Daybell in his writings, you see much of that same language repeated. The Constitution hanging by a thread, this idea that the end times are coming and that'll be up to the Mormon people to really save the United States. So that was kind of where I began with my reporting. But then what I really wanted to know was, how did these two people meet? It seemed that Lori and Chad believed the same things. So what circumstances did they meet on? And what I found was that they met on a set of these sort of prepper conferences that are around the fringes of the mainstream LDS Church that exist really in Idaho, Arizona, Utah, Nevada. And they met there because Chad was a speaker. Lori was very interested in his ideas, and they fell in love, apparently, the first time they met. But at those conferences, you'll find people who are very interested in exploring the kind of fringes of the faith, who think maybe the white horse prophecy actually is real,
Mhm.
that maybe the church in Salt Lake City isn't giving the full truth about some things. They're sort of seeking their own knowledge on topics that are really not kosher to talk about in church.
Mhm.
So that's what I found. I don't know that the LDS faith is particularly more, that there's something baked into it
Mhm.
that makes people have these ideas. Certainly, not to commit violence in the name of those ideas. There are some people who would argue that they do.
Mhm.
Um, I haven't found that in my reporting, but I have found quite a few cases over the years, over the decades, really, where people have used their very fringe interpretations of the LDS faith to commit violence, and often against innocent people.
What is it about the LDS Church that seems to allow people to go to some of these fringes and basically teeing them up to
Mhm.
a certain level? I mean, every religion, I'm not trying to bash religions, but every religion, of course, has fantastical elements to it. I mean, it
Sure.
is what religion is. It's based on faith. LDS has their own set of them. I mean, the whole Joseph Smith story. If you're not LDS, you look at it and you're kind of like, what the hell? But a lot of that's their faith, and okay, that's what you believe. But there are a lot of bizarre beliefs within that faith, uh, which almost are contrary to many others. It seems
Mhm.
in terms of putting people, human beings, into places of almost um, divine power, if you will.
Hmm.
But it's all dictated by the church. Is that is kind of walking up to that level with the church, and then some people walking out of the church? Sometimes the catalyst for that, where well, the church says, you can be like this if so and so says you are, but I'm not going to wait to get that title. I'm just going to leave and start it myself. That seems to be what we have with a lot of people like Chad or some of the other individuals who have broken off uh, Jeffries and that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting observation. I think that one thing that's unique about the LDS faith is that the church encourages people to have a personal relationship with God.
Hmm.
So to receive, to talk to God, to receive personal revelation from God and direction, maybe on how to live their lives. The church is very clear that that personal revelation is to be shared with your spouse, with your family, but it's really not supposed to, as I often say, it's not supposed to walk out the front door and start distributing. The church hierarchy in Salt Lake City receives revelation from God for the whole church,
Hmm.
but that personal revelation is where things get kind of sticky, because as you say, over the years people have received personal revelation that they believe means they're supposed to lead the church.
Yeah.
And I suppose if you believe in personal revelation, you wouldn't want to doubt that thing. And you would say, maybe it's a risk enough to take for me to walk out the front door and start spreading my own gospel.
Hmm.
I think another thing that is important to understand is that the Mormon faith is very new in the
Yeah.
broad scheme of things. And
Yeah.
so, I think any religious faith, when given, put under a lens, has some questionable things in its history.
Sure.
Um, I think that one thing that is a little bit of a thing to talk about is that the church really lionizes its handful of presidents that it's had in less than 200-year
Mhm.
history. And one of those I talk about a lot in my book is a man named Ezra Taft Benson, who actually worked in Washington, D.C. for the federal government as the Secretary of Agriculture for quite some time. And then afterward, he came to be the president of the LDS Church. And he said a lot of things in that role about that there were vast conspiracies in the federal government, that there were, he had a really conspiratorial mindset. But because he was the president of the church, people believed,
Mhm.
well, why would he lie? So, Benson's books are still sold in Deseret Book, which are the, bookstores run by the church. Benson's history is still very, very much a part of things. And I think that it would be important for the LDS Church as a whole to kind of re-examine his history and how it maybe sowed a sense of conspiracy
Mhm.
into the population of the church, that people were taught to kind of maybe doubt the narrative of things, or embrace a real conspiratorial, anti-government even mindset,
Mhm.
even violent mindset, because those words are still taught and studied today.
Sure. I mean, I think that's where you get individuals like a Chad Daybell. He's writing the books
Sure.
about the end of the world. He's talking about it to anyone who will happen to listen. And then, oh, hey, here comes Lori Vallow, who certainly seems like she needs something in her life. And there's Chad, and you have the cornucopia of crazy. Um, when we go back to the beginning of Chad and his books, which really weren't very popular, didn't really have a good following. He's a horrible, horrible writer. But it spoke to some people. At the end of the day,
Mhm.
it's the message that seems to matter, and it certainly resonated. Um, where did Chad begin doing this? Like, why did he start writing these books? What was his inspiration to become what I think he thought of himself as a prophet, if you will, in his own little break off of LDS?
Yeah, it's a journey that I travel down. So he always wanted to be a writer, and in fact, kind of got his start, I would say, working for the student newspaper at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, which is not far from the town he grew up in. I went there and went to the special collections there to read all of his articles, and you saw someone, a young person just like I was, experimenting with their voice, but also really embracing, even then, kind of a conspiratorial side of the LDS faith that I thought was very interesting. At a certain point, journalism wasn't enough for him. He worked in newspapers. Journalism is about writing about facts.
Hmm.
And I think that he had big aspirations to write fiction. And there was a trend really in the 1990s, late 90s, early 2000s, when these what we would call near death experience writers were becoming very, very popular in America, but also very much so in Utah and in the LDS faith. People who said, I died, I saw Jesus, and I came back to tell you, the Mormon people are the chosen ones. That became very interesting to Chad. He started to talk about that maybe he had his own near death experience. People in his family that I talked to said they never heard him refer to this ever.
Hmm.
But he not only claims one, but two near death experiences. And he started his own book publisher at a certain point. So I think he saw there was a real economic benefit from publishing other near death experience writers. So he started doing that. Some of them became very popular. And then at a certain point, he started writing his own books. All of his books are couched as fiction, but they often do start, I've read all of them. They start with an author's note that says, over time, this is fiction, but some of it might be real. And then you see him kind of becoming more and more bold, like maybe not being so afraid that the church will cramp down on him and saying, this is real. I
Yeah.
believe this is what's happening.
And within those writings, obviously he didn't have a huge following, but Lori was drawn into this. what before we even get to Lori entering the picture, I want to get this kind of some conjecture on this, uh, because it'll be important for I think later in the conversation. Chad going into this, writing these books, seeing that there's some sort of financial gain here, however small it may be, but it's something, and it gives
Mhm.
him some purpose. It gives him some attention. It seems like this is kind of a loner type individual, really didn't have it most of his life, and now suddenly, ooh, look at me. I write these things, and there's enough people that go, oh, must be something to this. Um, do you think he believed these books, his writings, these experiences that he had, or was this kind of a narcissistic ruse of, hey, this seems to be getting a response. I'm going to keep going down this road.
It's hard to know. Honestly, I think maybe if we, in his forthcoming trial this next spring, I think maybe we'll learn more about how true those beliefs were to him. I mean, certainly he was building a sort of mindset that you see over time that I've observed really at the far right political fringe, a kind of, uber libertarian mentality, talking about committing violence against liberals or that
Mm.
people need to escape to Idaho to be safe.
Yeah.
I think that he really he seemed to believe that. He moved his family from Utah, where they'd always lived, very suddenly north. His wife Tammy was very surprised. He said, I kind of spoken to God. I heard a voice and it said we need to move to Idaho, and she was like, "Really? Oh, okay." And they did go.
Mhm.
So I think that alone shows that he believed in enough. He was willing to uproot his very large family to a place that they had no network. But there, within these circles I've been telling you about, there is this idea that Utah is broken, that it's not going to be the new Zion where the Mormon people will be reborn when Jesus comes again. They will be lifted up, and saved. But there are people who believe that Idaho, specifically Rexburg, Idaho, will be that place. That's the new Zion. And I mean, it seems silly to talk about, but there are people who really think that. So, in terms of belief, that is what we know. At least he believes those things. Over time, he became such a fixture on these circuits because of his books. He gave a lot of speeches. He would do a lot of home meetings with small groups talking about his ideas and, kind of doing kooky things like using pendulums to discern, people's questions, very occult practices. So, whatever it was, it was working for him in a way that I think any other writing he'd done previously hadn't.
Why Rexburg?
Boy, I wish I could answer that. I think that Idaho is a fascinating place. I've spent, much of my career reporting a lot in Idaho. It's a state where there's a long history of an embrace, not a mainstream embrace, but enough of an embrace of fringy people. So in the northern part of the state, you've had groups like the Aryan Nations that moved there and found a lot of support, and that were also chased out by the community. In southern Idaho, that is, really an extension of Utah. It's a very, very LDS area. At the same time, through like the 1970s and the 1980s, it was very popular for the John Birch Society, which is kind of, a group you don't hear a lot about these days. But at the time, it was a real conspiratorial group. Political group who believe, the communists were going to come streaming over the borders, the world was going to end at any time. John Birch Society membership was very popular with members of the LDS Church. So I think that over the years, the Salt Lake Valley has really diversified. It's become very similar to a lot of other Western cities. It's changed a lot. The percentage of LDS people that live there, where the church is based, is very low at this point. So I think by going to Rexburg, you're going to a place that has a BYU campus, it has a temple, and is very, very heavily Mormon. Something like 80% of the population there is LDS. So you move there, you're around maybe more people that have a history of kind of embracing these sort of John Birchy ideas and that kind of thing. That's the best explanation I can give.
That makes sense. I mean, kind of the, conditioning of the area, and then
Mhm.
that's kind of their base level, and it seems a lot more normal, if you will, or common. That is the
Right.
norm in that area. Then, um, when we get to the intermingling of Lori into this story, yes, they're at this conference. They meet each other. If you read the what is it, Chad and Elena? Was that the character? No, what was the names? Elena and
Uh, oh my gosh, I'm
yeah,
spacing it.
I'm
James and Elena,
James and
James and
Elena, the
Elena.
James and
Right.
Elena, the text love story from Chad Daybell, which I think is always fun to read with dramatic music behind. If you ever
Yeah, I
want to
mean,
laugh, it's
it's
just
probably the only way to read it without getting
exactly,
sick.
exactly. So, I mean, obviously, a very loose interpretation of what he believed happened with their interaction and kind of how they came together. The question a lot of us are looking at right now, as you kind of dig back into this, is where did these extreme beliefs kind of originate? Was Chad the one that drew Lori in with these extreme beliefs, and then Lori was just an idiot and just kind of just fell into this? Or was it more of her that kind of had extreme beliefs, and Chad was willing to do pretty much anything the pretty blonde lady that was giving him attention said? When we look at that intermingling, how do you think that actually went, or from what you've researched, how did that all come together in terms of who's pulling what strings?
Right. Initially when I started reporting my project, I really dove hard into Chad because there was just so much of his writing,
Hmm.
his books. He was a big member of this very conspiratorial prepper website called Another Voice of Warning, and really posted prolifically about his ideas. So, initially when I started hearing about this case, I saw so much scrutiny of Lori Vallow, and I thought, is this, one of those cases where we're doing the kind of, Britney Spears, Casey Anthony, or whatever thing where we're just like rushing to
Yeah.
criticize this mother? But then over time, I was able to dig more into her family's past and wrote a lot about how her father really had these same kind of conspiratorial anti-government worldview. In fact, the day that I believe that Lori was arrested, her father published a book on Amazon called How oh, I'm forgetting the name. It was about how Americans can basically flout the IRS. You don't have to pay your taxes. And you don't have to pay your taxes because of my religious beliefs and all that.
Hmm.
That to me was really notable because it made me wonder, did Lori grow up hearing about a real conspiratorial mindset from her father? She was raised in California, not kind of in the basket of the Mormon church that Chad was growing up just south of Provo in Utah. Um, but her father was really talking about those same kinds of things. So that led me kind of down a reporting hole of, what did he believe? Were there other things that maybe she talked about? And so, I don't know that she I think that what I'm trying to say is I think she was ripe for the picking when it came to these ideas. They would have arrived in her mind as maybe something that was familiar, that she'd heard before. So you also have a person with Lori that really craved a certain level of fame. She tried to be a beauty queen. She was on Wheel of Fortune, a model, and all these things. And at a certain point, became a mom and had all kinds of different failed marriages, and really was kind of, it seemed to be that she was craving something. She was
Hmm.
craving celebrity. Chad had some level of celebrity within this group of people who thought that they were the most true believers. So
Sure.
it's really hard, and especially after sitting through her trial last year, I think there's a lot of evidence that the guilt is equal.
Yeah.
I think they were both really egging each other on.
Hmm. And when you look at the egging each other on,
Mhm.
what I think a lot of us have been watching and wondering, and we just saw it kind of come to fruition here just a couple weeks ago, uh, is somebody going to break here? Is somebody going to flip, if you will?
Mhm.
And I think flip's a weird way of describing it in this case, because you think of flipping of like, oh, someone's consciously knows that this is wrong, and they're going to flip on the other person. For a while, I don't think either of them seemed to realize everything that they were doing was wrong. Lori, I question if she does to this day, judging from what her speech was at the sentencing. the kids have great new jobs at Home Depot in heaven, or whatever it was that they're working at this week. Tasty Freeze, maybe. But Chad, we finally heard from him. He's saying it was all Lori. She was the one. Anything she said, I was going to do it. It was her that was controlling me and Alex. Um, Interesting, to say the least. But how true was that? Do you think at some point did the dynamic shift at some point, and Chad really was willing to do pretty much anything she wanted, considering his family's been knocked off now, so is hers, and he's got her. So what else are you gonna do at that point? He kind of, I think, got to his ultimate goal of he had Lori, but the context of it is everyone's crazy. You think your kids are demons, and they're dead. It's a bizarre place to be. Where do you think that all, or how that all kind of came to be?
Yeah, I mean, I was just as sort of surprised as anyone because this took 3 years for one of them to flip. I mean, I thought even before I published my book over a year ago that somebody was going to flip,
Yeah.
but it seemed that they stuck together, that they were real true believers. Um, I think what's interesting about Chad saying it was all Lori was that particularly in that ecosystem that I've been talking to you about at the fringes of the LDS faith, that is a very conservative, very patriarchal part of the LDS faith. It's very male dominated. And so I actually kind of find it a little funny that he's like, "Oh, well, I was taking the direction from a lady." It just doesn't really hold up for me.
Mhm.
I also don't know that it's really provable in court from everything that we saw in Lori's trial. There's these text messages over time about, there's one about Charles Vallow, Lori's husband, that was shot by her brother, and in conversations about trying to get his life insurance, Chad says something to the effect of, "I wonder if it got changed before or after he had 2 bullets in his chest." So it's kind of one of those things where you see the callousness there, that there was this sort of plan at play, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know how that's going to be proven, but I'm very curious if this is a tactic that was shopped by his defense attorney who
Yeah.
sat through all of Lori's trial, or if this is really the only way that they think that they're going to get out of this because it looks so bad.
It feels like it's the only way, I would guess. I mean, just the fact that the admission was made that way of it's all Lori, I mean, it almost admitted guilt, right there, to the
Yeah.
murder itself, without actually crossing that line. I'm wondering if at this moment in time they're just trying to save his life, and there really is not a big hope of any sort of defense, just like there wasn't much of a defense when Lori was on trial.
Yeah, and that could be. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about 2 children that were killed, but also Chad's wife of nearly 30 years.
Yeah.
So it just feels a little like, I don't know, man. Like that Tammy Daybell stood by his side throughout all of his writings and his like you said before, his writings were not successful. They really at one point they declared bankruptcy. So
Yeah.
um she really stood by him. So it just feels interesting to me that he would say, "Well, Lori made me kill my wife." Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. How did Chad justify and Lori justify all the chaotic behavior? Literally the orchestration of these deaths. Because if you're going down the road of, okay, they have extreme beliefs, they think the end of the world is near. I don't know where that equates to. Let's kill our former spouses and children. I would be thinking for most prepping type individuals, it's hold them close and do whatever you can to protect them. They kind of did the exact opposite, but did it bold faced, saying, "This is God. This is God's mission. This is what He wants us to do." How did they cross that bridge when they are
Yeah.
acting in this uber religious belief system, but somehow justification and, I mean, very maniacal, very well planned murders and executions were taking place around them?
Mhm. Yeah, I think I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think that during the trial, we saw evidence that they referred to the people who were killed as obstacles that they
Hmm.
needed to be gotten rid of. For anyone, I guess, that's maybe coming to this case for the first time, Lori and Chad believed themselves to be the leaders of the 144,000 prophesied in the book of Revelation, that they would be the ones to sort of pick and choose who would be the chosen ones that, would be saved by Jesus. And they also had this really strange matrix of deciding whether or not somebody was a dark or a light spirit. So over time, people would sort of descend into darkness, and then they would rename them.
Hmm.
They would sort of kind of do these classic things to really villainize them and dehumanize them before killing them eventually. I mean, allegedly, this is what Chad is accused of. So I think that it was interesting listening to the trial, because the prosecutor said, this doesn't have anything to do with religion. This is all about money and power and a sexual affair. Um, I think it was about more than that, because it was about those things, but they chose to use this religious language to kind of create a world for themselves that they could justify this behavior. I mean, that's the best way that I can explain it,
Yeah.
was that these were simply people that needed to be eliminated. But you'll also notice that in the case of JJ, of Tylee, of Charles Vallow, of the failed drive-by shooting of
Hmm.
Brandon Boudreaux, that these were all people with life insurance policies. So in a way, they were each a bit of a large coin purse
Hmm.
for them. And that is also, I think, what explains why Lori and Chad were so quiet for so long. They needed to keep these people alive in the eyes of the government so they could keep, cashing their checks. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say life insurance checks. They were getting like Social Security and disability checks and things like that.
And then to justify that, I mean, are they sitting there thinking, well, yeah, these are dark spirits. These are, I mean, I know they were calling the kids zombies at some point.
Mhm.
And yeah, everybody was on the light and dark scale and all of that. It was that, I mean, a real kind of passive aggressive, you are very screwed up in the head, there's some sort of mental disorder going on here, way of justifying the murders and ways of justifying getting rid of these people. So it somehow did make them in the right to take this money, because they're going to use that money for for the good of spreading their crazy message. And if people have to die to do it, then well, that's just what God would want. And they're basically martyrs. Is that kind of the
Yeah.
direction?
I think so. I mean, there's an insane amount of excuses that were made along the way to sort of justify this behavior. And I really think that the sort of ultimate portrayal of that was what you referenced earlier, the comments that Lori made at her sentencing, where she said, my children are fine. They have come to me. They said they're okay. They said, don't worry, mom. Those were really chilling comments to hear, because you just see the sort of magical thinking that she's had to do to really just sort of live with herself and justify these things. We also heard from the judge at her sentencing that she has an extremely complex mental health diagnosis. I won't even surmise to talk about what it all means,
Yeah.
but I think it'll be very interesting to see if a similar diagnosis or something like that is at play with Chad Daybell, or if it's something more. If he doesn't have one, that almost seems more nefarious.
I mean, it does. It feels like maybe he was getting in way too deep, and his desire to have her was, overriding literally everything. And maybe he thought he could, run down that road as far as he could. The fact that she stuck with it for so long is, extremely disturbing. And with that being said, we do have the possibility here of another trial for
Mhm.
Lori Vallow in Arizona, unless there's some sort of plea deal between now and then. Um, and I said it at the beginning of the last one. I know there was no insanity defense there, but should there be? I mean, is this someone who really needs to be standing trial anymore? We're talking specifically about Lori. Yes, you want someone to pay for the crimes. At the end of the day, the victims sitting in that courtroom, uh, they want to see that person have some sort of empathy, have some sort of feeling of having done wrong for the crimes that they committed. But you're never going to get that out of Lori. I don't think she's
Mm.
capable of doing it. I think that boat has sailed. The way that she would get there, I think, is far too painful, and her mind won't allow it to happen. So, with that being said, and whatever mental diagnosis we have going on here, are we just poking a monkey with a stick at this point in a cage? Or, I mean, yes, justice, we all want it, but should she just really kind of go away to either a prison system or a mental health facility for the rest of her life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question to ask. In Idaho, she went through, I want to say two, if not more, major mental health assessments. This was part of the reason the trial was delayed for so
Sure.
long, was that she kind of was going in and out of competency, as they call it.
Mhm.
Because I think they were trying to really understand, is this woman uh, so mentally ill that she can't understand what's happening here? But at the end of the day, they did decide, and the judge did decide she could understand that there was a lot of manipulation at play. So I guess if something else comes out that says that's not right, or if Arizona does their own assessment, then I think that would be the only way.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those difficult cases, and I've struggled myself with it for years, of trying to understand, what does this all mean. Could someone that presents themselves to be so normal, by all accounts, she was this mom that people were like, oh, she threw the best birthday party, she was so good to her kids. Is it possible that a person can turn on a dime, could be radicalized by one person or a set of writings, or maybe was dark all along? I don't know, but those, I think, are some of the reasons why this case remains so fascinating to examine, is that you just see a level of religiosity and manipulation that is just feels kind of unprecedented. So, I have to believe there's something to be learned from all of this. I'm not sure that it's quite presented itself, but it may be about that when the LDS faith tells people they can receive revelation, when it lionizes really conspiratorial people, when the climate around us in politics feels for everyone like it could end at any time, people who are unstable may take that to really bizarre ends that are difficult to understand.
Hey, it's Tony Bruschi. If you want more of our interview with our guests, be sure to check out our podcast, Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Just search that wherever you download podcasts and press subscribe. Also, you can check out our YouTube channel for the full video version of the interviews as well, under the same name, Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Check it out, subscribe, binge, and enjoy. Thanks for watching.